This is a lecture for Key Issue 3 of Political Geography. Why do boundaries cause problems? And this picture is lit. In 1982, the United Nations created this treaty, the Law of the Sea, under which a coastal state has exclusive fishing rights and sovereignty over a territorial sea of up to 12 nautical miles from its coast. Now, there's really more to it than just fishing, as offshore oil drilling have become quite a boon to any state's economy which actually has resources that close to them. 2, it limited jurisdiction over a territorial sea up to 24 nautical miles from its coast. So in that space, in that stretch of ocean, the country has the right to enforce laws of immigration, sanitation, etc. So this is where you're going to see the Coast Guard patrolling, ensuring that no one is dumping waste there, ensuring that no one is trying to sneak into the country there. And up to 200 nautical miles away from the shoreline of a country is its exclusive economic zone, and that gives the country the right to explore and extract natural resources. And so this whole distance, you've got oil and other minerals, but usually oil that companies are being tasked with drilling out of the earth underneath the water. And beyond the EEZs of coastal states, the seas are open for free use by all states. The problem is that these EEZs overlap in many areas, and that can cause conflict and tension, especially where there may be a large oil reserve or where there is a particularly important shipping route, whether it is for moving goods or whether it is a military, a navy doing an operation. We're going to talk about some examples where countries have butted heads over these overlapping claims. So here's what we just talked about from land out, usually the deep sea area known as the high sea. That's where anyone has the right to sail or to ship goods. You come in, and normally where there's a continental shelf, you have that EEZ expanded out to 200 nautical miles from the baseline, and then again that territorial sea 12 nautical miles from the baseline. You can't just sail up into someone else's territorial sea whenever you want. Why care so much about this water and who owns what water? It's not like people can very easily live on water. Well, as we've talked about before, there's so much more than just where people can live, because in the modern world we're very concerned about resources. So included in that, of course, is fishing, as fish is a plentiful supply of food and protein for people. It's worth a lot of money. Oil is worth a lot of money, of course. We use oil far and away more than we use green energy all across the globe still, not just for our automobiles, but for heating and for powering electrical grids. Trade is incredibly important. If you happen to be in a state that's blessed with a good location, that state can definitely benefit from engaging in trade itself on the high seas, and also being a pathway for other countries to do trade. So you might make a lot of money having break of bulk points, having these shipping ports where goods are transitioned and moved to other ships, or by supplying ships with fuel as they're on their long journey, stuff like that. But also there is a military aspect to this. And what you see here in this picture is the South China Sea. And it is called the South China Sea, but if you really look at it, it's not just a sea that China has. In fact, there are other countries that are really closer to it than China. You've got Vietnam, you've got Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines. All of these countries claim part of the South China Sea. And as you can see in the blue dotted line, you have the United Nations Law of the Sea outlining the 200 nautical mile EEZ zone. And so you can see from each one of those states, much of the sea is taken up. But you'll also see in the red dotted line that China claims these territorial waters all the way out really close, much closer than 200 nautical miles to the coast of these other countries. And China claims that's a historical claim. And the way that they are trying to legitimize that claim is by beginning to inhabit many of these islands in what are known as the Spratly Islands. And one in particular China's been working on for a while, and that's Fiery Cross Island. And among others, Fiery Cross Island was a natural reef, and China has been building it up, bringing ships in and basically just pumping sand and rocks onto the reef to build it up so they can put an airstrip on it, which they've done, so they can have a military presence there. And once they can legitimize that as part of their territory, then it makes it hard for anyone to argue that they shouldn't have 200 nautical miles of EEZ off of the coast of that island. So this is what China is doing to try to take claim over all of the South China Sea. Not long ago, just a couple of years ago, this became a major issue when the United States was doing was sailing one of its destroyers. I say sailing, obviously it doesn't use sails, but one of its destroyers was moving through the South China Sea because that's what the United States does. We try to have a military presence everywhere to make sure that order is in place, especially near China, where it seems like China can definitely has the power advantage over these other countries. And China sent one of their ships after us, basically trying to chase us out of these waters. And things like that don't happen very often. An actual military encounter like that, especially with China. So it is something that is of grave concern to a lot of people following along with the relationship between the US and China. Let's talk about boundaries. We've looked at this in our book. A state is separated from its neighbor by a boundary. What is a boundary? It's an invisible line that marks the extent of a state's territory. And of course, it is invisible. It's not real. It may have a marker in some places, but in most places, it is only marked on a map. So it's an infinitely thin line. Historically, it was frontiers that separated states. And that would be a zone where no state exercises complete political control. It's also a tangible geographic area, and it's uninhibited or at least sparsely populated. Frontiers have now been replaced by boundaries. And the reason for that is because, well, there's multiple reasons. One, populations have grown, and as populations have grown, they have pushed out. States have, over hundreds of years, understood that part of their power comes from the amount of territory that they can control. And so as states have bounded out, they've bumped up into each other and had to set up boundaries. And one of the other reasons for frontiers being replaced by boundaries is the desire to have, for a state to have as many natural resources as it can. So even if there's a desert here and there's not many people living there, and maybe there never will be, if there's oil, they definitely want to be able to say where their boundary is instead of it just being more loosey-goosey like a frontier. Let's talk about the types of physical boundaries. The desert boundary, which I just alluded to, it's a boundary because it's hard to cross and sparsely inhabited, doesn't have, usually doesn't have much water, and so there's not going to be many people living there. A mountain boundary effectively divides two states if the mountains are difficult to cross. This can be a useful boundary because it's permanent, and whereas a desert might change because two states argue over mineral rights in the desert, or it might change because a state could, if it wanted to, pump in water or bring in resources on train or vehicles. A mountain, there's only so much you can do to make that less of a boundary. Certainly you can dig tunnels through a mountain, but it's still going to remain as a permanent boundary. And then a water boundary is a less permanent one overall than mountains because of the tendency of water levels to change in bodies of water and river channels to move over time. One example of a water boundary, and sorry I skipped over to the next slide, would be the boundary between Tennessee and Arkansas, the Mississippi River, and we'll look in a minute at how that has changed. But the boundary between Mexico and the United States of the Rio Grande River has changed. And so in some places, parts that used to be Mexico are now the US, and parts that used to be the US are now Mexico. A mountain boundary, the Andes Mountains, separate the long countries of Argentina and Chile. And the boundary between Malawi and Mozambique runs through Lake Nyasa, or Lake Malawi. Another water boundary I mentioned, and you can see it here, is the boundary between Tennessee and Arkansas. And you'll note that even though the river has changed course over time, and what you see in this picture is the current flow of the river, the political boundary has remained, and that reflects the path that the river used to take when the boundary was set up. And so you can literally, just on the other side of the river from Memphis, there are pockets of Tennessee in what we all usually assume to be Arkansas, because the political boundary remains even if the river has changed. Kind of interesting. And then there are cultural boundaries. And we know cultural boundaries include geometric boundaries and ethnic boundaries. Those geometric boundaries are just straight lines drawn on a map. Ethnic boundaries are boundaries that coincide with the differences in ethnicity, especially language and religion. So those are the two big factors used to define these ethnic boundaries. Language differences influenced the demarcation of boundaries in England, France, Portugal, and Spain before the 19th century in Europe. British India was partitioned into predominantly Hindu India and predominantly Muslim Pakistan and Bangladesh. So there are two examples of how language can be used to demarcate boundaries, how religion can be used to demarcate boundaries. Ireland is predominantly Catholic, and Northern Ireland is mostly Protestant. So sometimes this can really mean the difference between whether or not a country remains together as one ethnicity or if it is split up. As you should know, Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, which is itself predominantly Protestant. Let's look at types of cultural boundaries because we can break this down even further. An antecedent boundary is created before an area is populated, the US and Canada. So these antecedent boundaries are often going to be geometric boundaries, that straight line between the US and Canada. And as the area around the border between the US and Canada has become more populated, especially if you're getting into the western region, it's still very sparsely populated. Subsequent boundary follows cultural landscape. So the boundary of Sudan and the newest republic, South Sudan, is meant to be split along cultural lines between Arab Sudanese and Black Sudanese. Then you also have a superimposed cultural boundary, and that's one drawn by outsiders without regard for local ethnic groups. A lot of times these will be geometric in shape because, quite frankly, it's just the easiest, laziest way to do it. Many African countries have superimposed boundaries. North and South Korea, though, also have a superimposed boundary, and that boundary isn't really a border, it's just an armistice line. You also have relict boundaries. I said the way that I remember this one is a relic is something that's old, that's not used anymore. These boundaries no longer exist technically, but you can still see the effects of them. And so they can, in some ways, still show a historical difference. You can see this between North and South Vietnam, which was separated between the communists and those who were on the side of the United States in the Vietnam War. You can see a split between East and West Berlin, which was a split, which was a wall that split the communist bloc of East Berlin, which is the city in Germany, and the Western democratic capitalist Germany. And even very old one, the Great Wall of China. Left, you see the demilitarized zone between North Korea and South Korea. This is heavily defended by both sides. In the bottom left, you have the US-Canadian border. This is the longest undefended border in the world. Undefended meaning there's not actively troops there. We do have border patrol. Canada does too, but because it's just not that much of a problem, there is not a large amount of troops stationed there. And part of that is because the US and Canada are both friends. The other part is because there's not many people desperately trying to leave from one country to go to the next. Although a lot of people said they were going to move to Canada in this last election cycle. I know some have tried, but they're not going to go so far as hiking across the snowy plains to do so. Bottom right, you have the Rio Grande, which forms the border between Mexico and the United States, and it's porous enough to allow millions of illegal immigrants to swim across, although it's very treacherous, very dangerous to do so. And just as an example of a relict boundary, there's a lot of different things you could look at that still show a difference between East Germany and West Germany, but just look at the unemployment rate, where it's much higher in the former Soviet occupied or former communist, I should say, East Germany compared to West Germany. Now, of course, there are a lot of disputes over boundaries, and we're going to quickly go over some of the types of boundary disputes. You have a positional dispute or a dispute over definition, where states argue about where the border actually is. Argentina and Chile have argued over this. Why? Well, because their border is just historically been the mountains. And yet, what happens when you try to decide where exactly on the mountains is that thin line that you call the border? Territorial boundaries disputes, where states argue over the ownership of a particular region. This is usually around mutual borders. And if you go back to the German invasion of Poland and Czechoslovakia in World War II, Germany claimed that this was territory that they historically and had always really had. Resource or allocational boundary dispute. These involve natural resources that lie in border areas. Again, you're going to get into these kind of disputes in frontier borders especially, or frontier boundaries especially. And as part of why those frontiers have been replaced with actual boundaries. Places like Iraq and Kuwait, which are known for their vast oil reserves, Saudi Arabia and Yemen, the same thing. And then functional or operational disputes. Neighboring states cannot agree on policies that apply to a border area, like the US and Mexico. And the changing flow or changing location of the Rio Grande River could be an example of this. Now, something we've already gone over, centrifugal and centripetal forces. We're going to look at this again real quick. Remember that centrifugal forces destabilize the government and encourage the country to fall apart. One way of looking at this is they push people out from the middle. Like if you're on the ride at the Delta Fair, it pushes you up against the wall and the floor drops down and you don't slide down. That is a centrifugal force pushing on you. I won't pretend to know more about physics than that, but my understanding is that's what is happening. And in some ways, that's a good way of looking at this. Things that push everyone out away from the middle, so effectively away from each other. Let's look at the different types. You could have political forces. Maybe there is an imbalance in the majority and the minority relationship. So maybe there is a majority of people with one political party, and there's a minority that can never quite get enough control. So they decide the best thing for them to do is to break away. Or there could be armed conflicts, and one group decides they are going to split away. Or maybe the military tries to take over control of the country. A lot of different scenarios there. Economic forces. There could be uneven development. Perhaps one part of the country has always done very well. Maybe they are blessed with more natural resources. Maybe they have a greater history of mechanization. If we think about the United States and the Civil War that occurred here, one of the big centrifugal forces was the difference in the economies, whereas the North was largely centered on manufacturing. The South was agrarian. The South was reliant on agriculture, and that is why so many of the people in the South felt like they needed slaves. And that difference made the South poorer overall. Certainly some of the wealthiest people in the world during that time were the landowning slave owners. But that did not account for most of the population in the South. In general, the South was poorer, and they did not have the kind of resources to move up in the world like the North did. And so that uneven development was only part of what drove a wedge between the North and the South. But we can see this in other parts of the world. In Italy, the North has those big brands that you think about, the sports cars, the fashion brands. They're more industrial. There's a higher standard of living. There's more money. In the South, life moves slower. There's not as many big companies. There's not as much industry. And so you have uneven development. And that has driven a wedge between the North and the South in Italy. Cultural forces. You may have stateless nations in a particular area. And that might lead them to want to split apart, like the Kurds in northern Iraq. You could have ethnic movements like the French-speaking people of Quebec, or you could have conflicting religious or language groups, like the Flemish being very separate in Flanders from the Walloons in Wallonia in the country of Belgium, speaking different languages, having different ethnicities. Or another example, in Ireland, you've got Protestants in the north and you've got Catholics in the south, and that led to a lot of fighting. And eventually, the north became connected to the United Kingdom, part of the United Kingdom, whereas the south is its own republic. One reaction to centrifugal forces is devolution. That's the transfer of power from national government to state or local governments. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, because it can kind of assuage conflicts before they become violent. Britain has devolved power to Scotland and Wales in an effort to keep peace with them. So they've remained in the United Kingdom because they've gotten at least a greater amount of autonomy, a greater amount of power to govern themselves the way that they culturally see fit. The natives in northern Canada form the territory of Nunavut, and you've seen the picture here. This is their capital, and I won't even try to pronounce it, but these Inuit people living in a polar region of Canada, this is a huge territory, Nunavut, have seen fit to govern themselves in their own way, as culturally they're different than other Canadians. Forces that may lead to devolution of states include ethnic separatism, where you have ethnic groups feeling like they don't fit in with the rest of the state, like the Inuit people who created Nunavut. Terrorism, extremist groups taking control over a region. In parts of Africa, Boko Haram took control over the state and decided that that is their territory and they're going to rule it, they're going to govern it. Economic and social problems. We talked about this before. If one part of the country feels like they are not being represented, or they cannot get ahead while the rest of the country seems to be doing really well, they may want to split. Or it could be the opposite region, as the people in Barcelona have decided that the Catalonians have decided that all of their wealth doesn't need to be spread across Spain, and they want to split off for that reason, among other reasons. And then you have something known as irredentism. This is the belief that a territory belonging to another country should be annexed for ethnic or historical reasons. So Hitler tried to unite all Germans. He used this as really an excuse more than anything to take over parts of Czechoslovakia and Poland, saying that there are German-speaking people living here, and therefore we should control this territory. It was the same reasoning behind Russia annexing the Crimean region of Ukraine not too long ago, because there were Russian-speaking people there, ethnic Russians living there. And so Russia says this should be part of Russia. Devolution can go as far as balkanization. So remember, devolution is where different parts of the country are basically regionalized a bit more. People are given a little bit more autonomy, but it can go further than that to balkanization, where you actually have the breakup of a country into smaller countries, like what we saw when South Sudan broke off of Sudan, when Yugoslavia broke up, and the breakup of the Caucasus countries from the Soviet Union. This shows the tendency for mountain ranges to form shatter belts, which are zones containing many small cultural groups who find refuge in the rugged terrain of mountains. And then forces that unite. So here's where we get to talk about the happy stuff. Centripetal forces bind together people of a state and give it strength. There are political centripetal forces, national identity. So in the United States, the fact that most people are able to see themselves as Americans rather than just simply Southerners or Tennessean or someone from Washington. I don't know what you call those people, or someone or an Oregonian. If we can see past that, we are more likely to compromise, more likely to be willing to do whatever we have to do to keep the country moving forward as one state. Federal holidays contribute to this. Patriotism contributes to this. We talked about this in the last chapter. So if you need to go back to that lecture and hear some more examples, go for it. Economic forces, infrastructure development, basically things that connect the country, like our interstate system. The fact that I can hop on the interstate and drive to the other side of the country. It's going to take me a long time because it's a big place, but it's not that difficult. And when I'm in California, I still feel a connection to my own country because I feel like I'm not in someone else's land. Now, some people from the South might feel differently when they're in California because they think they're with just a bunch of hippies, but it's a more diverse place than just that. Although most people in California do see the world a little bit more differently than a lot of people around here. Cultural forces as well, linguistic, religious, ethnic similarities, sports, any kind of common ground that people may have. The fact that I can go all over the US and people are speaking English, and yes, people are speaking other languages, but the fact that we have the same language, that helps to unify us. Common religion. Now, the United States is open to all different religions, but there is the predominant religion of Christianity, which has given many people a sense of unity across the country. And yet, the fact that many people believe that that is the one religion of this country has led to some disunity and discord. But we can see examples of that across the globe. Ethnic similarities, and this is why nation states are often so stable, because they have those ethnic, linguistic, and religious similarities across the board. And sports, which team you're rooting for, can help you feel a greater connection with the other people of your state. We know that the shapes of states matter, and the shapes of states can affect how a government is able to govern the state. That sounded weird. Shapes of states control the length of its boundaries with other states. So if you think about it, a state like Chile, which is elongated, it has a very long boundary with other states. Fortunately, it's got mountains to service that boundary. But other states that have very long boundaries that may or may not cause a problem. It affects the potential for communication and conflict with neighbors. So sometimes it can be a good thing because you can communicate and you can do a lot of trade easily, but it could also be a bad thing if you don't get along with your neighbor. The United States is pretty lucky. We actually have really good neighbors. We have really long borders with Canada and Mexico, but we have very good neighbors. Much is made of the fact that we have a relatively unsecure border with Mexico, which does result in a lot of illegal immigration. But at the same time, Mexico itself is a pretty friendly neighbor, and we get along in general quite well with Mexico, and even to a greater degree with Canada. The shape is also part of a country's unique identity. Shape influences the ease or difficulty of internal administration and can affect social unity. And we're going to look at how this plays out. So here are the basic shapes. You've got compact states. The distance from the center of the state to any boundary is not very significantly. Poland is the go-to example here. And this is theoretically ideal, okay, because if your state was circular and you had the capital in the center, no one people group would feel too distant from the capital, would feel like they don't have a say in what's going on in the country, and the capital would not be too far away from any one part of the country to effectively govern, to know what's going on, to be able to get people there, get troops there, or get representation there to exert influence or to communicate with the people of the state. Elongated states, your long and narrow shape states. This could be a bad thing because it could suffer from poor internal communication. Example would be Chile. If the capital is up toward the north of an elongated state, and you've got people living at the bottom in the south, that could be quite a distance from the capital. Chile itself is 2,500 miles long north to south, and yet it's very thin. It's very narrow. It rarely exceeds 90 miles wide east or west. It's got mountains on the east and ocean on the west. Prorupted states. These are otherwise compact states, but have a large projecting extension. So this can just be kind of weird. Proruptions were created for two principal reasons. One, they may provide a state with access to a resource like water to help that state avoid from being landlocked, or they separate two states that otherwise would share a boundary. Perforated states are states that are completely surrounded, states that completely surround another one. So if something that's perforated has holes in it, it's as if a country has put a hole in this state. Encompassed state is dependent on the surrounding state for interactions beyond its boundary. So it's definitely a weird situation for the state that's in the middle of another state. The microstates that are in Italy perforate Italy, and they are totally dependent on Italy for trade, usually for defense, military, and also access to resources. Fragmented states are states that include several discontinuous pieces of territory. There's two kinds of fragmented states. Those separated by water, which are most of the kind that you're going to see in today's world, and those fragmented states that are separated by an intervening state. So the most extreme fragmented state is Indonesia. It's made up of over 13,000 islands, some big, many very small. An example that no longer exists of a fragmented state separated by an intervening state would be East and West Pakistan. West Pakistan is now just Pakistan, but East Pakistan is Bangladesh. Here are some more examples of those different shapes of states. Philippines is also fragmented. Vietnam is another elongated state. South Africa is perforated by Lesotho, which is dependent on South Africa. Cambodia is a pretty compact state. It's obviously not perfectly circular, but it's almost as close as most states will get. And Thailand has this protrusion coming out. Another example could be the United States, and Florida is part of that, or part of Florida is that strange protrusion that we have, or prorupted. An exclave is an outlier of a state that's physically detached from the state. An example would be Alaska. If you look at a map of the United States, you'll see Alaska, they just kind of stick somewhere. But we know Alaska is up there bordering Canada. Or Kaliningrad in Russia. This is between Poland and Lithuania. It's not attached to Russia at all. It's important to know that islands are not exclaves. A country could have an enclave. So an enclave lies within a country, but is independent or ruled by another country. Vatican City, we've talked about as a microstate, is technically an enclave in Rome, in Italy. San Marino also is in Italy, or Lesotho in South Africa. Now, these are political examples, but you could also think of something as an ethnic enclave. So you might have a lot of Kurdish people living in one part of Iraq. They may not politically be totally separate, but they are an ethnic enclave. Landlocked states have a serious disadvantage in trade and access to resources. Africa has more landlocked states than any other continent. In Asia, Mongolia and Nepal are landlocked with rough terrain. They have great distances and very limited communication. You've also got Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia on that list. South America, Bolivia and Paraguay are landlocked. And Bolivia actually lost its border to Chile in the late 1800s during what was known as the War of the Pacific, and has really been trying to get it back ever since then. And in Europe, Austria, Switzerland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Moldova, Belarus, and Bosnia are landlocked. At least in Western Europe, the United Nations, but the EU helps those countries that are landlocked by having a common currency and participation standards across the continent. Those countries benefit from working in cooperation with one another, even if they are landlocked. Let's take a look now at the types of national governments, because these have a large effect on how people's lives are governed. A democracy is a country in which citizens elect leaders and can run for office. An autocracy is a country that is run according to the interests of the ruler rather than the people. And somewhere in between those two is an anocracy. That's a country that's not fully democratic or fully autocratic, but a mixture of both. Let's look at anocracy. It describes a regime type that is characterized by inherent qualities of political instability and effectiveness, as well as incoherent mix of democratic and autocratic traits and practices. So usually they'll claim to be democratic, but they don't really follow through on the main principles of democracy, like free elections or transparent governments. These regimes are particularly susceptible to outbreaks of armed conflict and unexpected or adverse changes in leadership. Most of the countries in the world today, and I think this is because of the independence movement after World War II, would consider themselves, or at least claim to be, democratic. And that would be that they hold elections and the power resides with the people, and voting is the way in which people get to define their government and what their government does. And yet, many of these countries would fall into this category of anocracies. They have questionable elections in many cases. And we're going to look at some examples and why it's so difficult for countries to move from autocracy swiftly into full democracy. I shouldn't say full democracy, but at least representative democracy. In Asia, Cambodia, unstable government with abrupt changes in leadership. Thailand, constant political upheaval since 1993. Burma, which is now known as Myanmar, adverse armed conflict, changes in leadership. Not too long ago, the government took over and has really been transitioning Burma. And strange thing is that even though they did some terrible things back in the past, they're kind of trying to reform themselves, and the international community is kind of left with this situation where they have to accept this new government. Well, it's not a new government, but they have to accept this new government and want to accept the good things that that government is doing, and yet it's hard to forget about some of the atrocities that occurred under this regime. In Africa, Nigeria is an open anocracy. It's really closer to democracy, though. Zimbabwe, electoral conflicts and human rights violations. Uganda, transition from anocracy to a close anocracy. In Somalia, it's been an open anocracy since 2013. In Europe, Russia is an open anocracy. Democratic elections, but ones that are very free. Excuse me, not very free, according to many groups that examine elections and the standards by which those elections exist. Vladimir Putin is the president of the Russian Federation, has been since 2012. Previously, before that, he held the presidency from 2000 until 2008, and he was also prime minister from 1999 until 2000, and then prime minister again from 2008 to 2012. So this is somebody who obviously has the support of most of the people of his country, and they've kind of bent the rules for him so that effectively he can be in charge for the past something like 17 years. But as far as Russia having open or fair elections, while they're open, they can be considered not very free, because there was no real opposition ahead of the last election. There wasn't really a campaign battle. There were not many laws restricting the government from having police break up demonstrations by opposing groups, or stopping harassment from critics. And the Freedom House, which is a human rights organization, said that the victory of Putin's party in 2007 was achieved under patently unfair and non-competitive conditions, calling into doubt the results' legitimacy. In Ukraine, there have been very questionable elections. And when we say questionable elections, we mean we just can't be sure that the ballots were actually anonymous, right? So one of the things that's important about an election is that when you vote, no one should get to know who you voted for, so you can't be intimidated. And that's not always the case. But also in some countries, they'll have these complete farces of an election where everyone votes, but then someone in power just decides who should be quote unquote elected. Countries with successful transitions from anocracy to democracy include Mexico, Taiwan, Ghana. There are going to be varying levels of success there, but these countries have made great strides. This map, I don't want you to, so to speak, take this map to the bank, because even though it is based on empirical evidence, anything like this can be disputed. But in general, this is a pretty realistic way of looking at the political breakdown of these countries, where you have fully democratic, and by that we mean representative democracy. True full democracy would be if everybody in the country voted on everything, which simply is not possible. But those countries in green are fully democratic. Much of Western Europe, you will note that there are some notable exceptions to countries that are somewhat democratic, but across much of the developing world, it is either autocratic or anocratic. How do democracies and autocracies differ? Well, let's look at three essential elements. One, the selection of leaders. In democracy, citizens can elect leaders. In autocracies, leaders are selected according to clearly defined, usually hereditary, rules of succession from within the political elite. And then you even have this in between, where I'm thinking of one example, Iran, where you do have these political elections, but in some cases, and I cannot promise this, but this is what most political analysts have said, the supreme leader, the Khamenei, is the one who actually decides who's going to be president or not. So if the wrong person gets elected, he's not going to allow that to happen. Again, I can't prove that, so you're not going to be tested on it or anything, but that is what most outsiders believe is going on, and many insiders, and has led to a lot of protest. Number two, citizen participation. In democracies, citizens may participate at all levels of government. You don't have to be in the military. You don't have to be born into this particular caste of society. All citizens theoretically can get to a point where they can participate in government. Autocracies, citizens' participation is restricted and often suppressed. Sometimes only one ethnicity is allowed in, or power passes very strictly through hereditary lines. And three, the checks and balances. In democracies, there are systems to check powers of all branches of government, meaning one branch should not have control over every aspect of government. Okay, so even though there's a lot of power in the White House, they have to get things passed by other branches. The White House theoretically is not allowed to carry out the enforcement of these laws. Autocracies. Leaders exercise power with no meaningful checks from legislative, judicial, or civil society institutions. In general, the world has become more democratic since the turn of the 19th century. You see in the 1950s there's this major jump and in democracies, also a rise in anocracies, as some countries are trying to get closer to being democratic. There are three major waves of democratization. The first wave is where development happened quite gradually, one country at a time. United States, was the first major democracy. We didn't necessarily invent democracy, but we did put it into play at a large scale. And then other countries in Western Europe followed. The second wave happened after the Allied victory in World War II, and it really happened because of decolonization around the globe. As new countries emerged, those European democracies that were beginning to, some of which were beginning to democratize themselves, were letting go of these countries, setting up democracies as they left. Some of these democracies worked well, some of them have not worked so well. The third wave is the defeat of dictatorial or totalitarian rulers from South America to Eastern Europe to some parts of Africa. So much of South America used to be controlled by military dictatorships, and those have seen a decline. And Eastern Europe, of course, was controlled by was communist and controlled by the Soviet Union, which collapsed. And then the same thing, military dictatorships in parts of Africa being replaced by civilian governments. One of the greatest obstacles to democratization is poverty, because poverty blocks citizen participation in government. If it's all that you can do to get enough food from the ground onto your kids' plates, you're not going to have time to protest the government. You're not going to have time to vote. You're not going to have the ability to get an education to serve in the government. And so one of the key factors in promoting democracies that actually work around the world is combating poverty. Why has democratization occurred? Why have more and more governments shifted toward democracy? The loss of legitimacy, right and left-wing authoritarian regimes, the expansion of urban middle class, again, people moving out of poverty, moving into a space or moving into an existence where they have some money, they have some time to participate, and also they have education enough to participate. The new emphasis on human rights in the US and the European Union, and the snowball effect. When one country in a region becomes democratic, it influences others to do so. And so really, this has served the United States well, as we want there to be more and more democracies around the world. And what we were so afraid of during the Cold War was really the same thing, but from the communist perspective. That as one country becomes communist, it's going to spread to the next one and the next one and the next one. Let's look at organization of governments and then we'll wrap this up. The unitary states place most power in the hands of the federal government. These work best in states with few internal cultural divisions and a strong sense of national unity. Unitary states require strong communication. They're usually smaller states. Smaller states are more likely to be unitary, again, because that strong communication can occur, and they're less likely to have these major cultural divisions from one side of the country to the other. Some multinational states have become unitary in order to impose values of one nationality on others. Examples of this, France, Kenya, Rwanda, China, many European countries. Whereas China culturally is different in the West than it is in the East, it is ruled as a unitary state so that those in power can impose values on the rest of the nation. Federal states allocate strong political power to units of local government within the country. And this is going to empower many different nationalities in a multinational state, especially if they live in separate regions. So if you have a different nationality or a different culture, different background, you might want your government to operate a little bit differently than someone living somewhere else. And so federal government gives you more power in your region. And for that reason, it's more suitable for large countries because the national capital might be too far away to be effective. So if you're living in Washington State, you are a long ways away from Washington, D.C. And you may feel like if Washington, D.C. ran absolutely everything, you might feel very detached from it. And that might lead you to want to break off or not go along with what D.C. is saying. Examples of federal states: the US, Canada, Russia, Brazil, India, and those are all big places. But Belgium is also on here, not because of its size, it's quite small, but because it has those two main cultural groups, Dutch, or the Dutch-speaking Flemish in the north, what's known as Flanders, and the French-speaking Walloons in the south, which is known as Wallonia. And there's even some people speaking German in the east there. So that brings us to electoral geography. The boundaries separating legislative districts within the US and other countries are redrawn periodically to ensure each has about the same population. There are 435 districts of the US House of Representatives that are redrawn every 10 years following the Census Bureau's release of the official population figures. This process of redrawing legislative boundaries for the purpose of benefiting the party that's in power during that year of the census, that's known as gerrymandering. And we've looked at some resources already on this to help us understand it, but we'll spend some more time talking about it in class. But this brings us to right about an hour for this lecture, which is a long time. So we're going to cap it off here and we'll pick this back up later. So that is the end of key issue 3.